This is working. Is it one? Let's try another one. Is this the one that had the... Oh, no, it's light screen. Was it technical difficulties? It was me difficulties. Okay, we're back in business. Sort of. Okay, good morning. We are in actually week number 2. It feels like we've been in July. Of course, July is almost over, but we are just into our second week of this quarter. Let me just remind you of a couple things. I got in the habit of doing this with the young adult class, so I can't help it now, so I just have to share things with you. The retreat next weekend, there will be fewer people here next weekend, or next Sunday. Oh, forget it does that. But if you haven't registered for the retreat, it's probably too late at this point. But if you plan on going, it's always a great time. Great event for our congregation. Then the weekend after that, we're doing our Single Moms Car Care Clinic again. We put the thing out, or the advertisement out on social media, I believe Monday, Tuesday maybe, and by Friday morning all of our slots are full. So people react to this. This is pretty incredible. But we still need some help. So if you didn't see the email, there's a sign up genius. You can go plug yourself in. If you don't know what I'm talking about and don't know how to work that, then come and tell me and we'll figure it out. And we need help with washing cars. We need help with just meeting the moms and widows that come and spend a few minutes with us. We need some help with backpacks with the single moms who have kids. So there are opportunities for you to serve if you'd like to on that Saturday. But pretty impressive that they're already full. And then, haven't mentioned this in a few months because this is our evangelism seminar that Steve Ridgel from Texas is going to come do for us. And his eyeball fell out or whatever happened last time. He had the eye problem. He literally had his eyeball get unhinged. So he got that all fixed and he's fine now. But he'll be here at the end of September. So mark your calendars for this. We'll give this another shot. And Steve, if you, I mean, most of you probably have no idea who Steve is. He is a man who is excited about sharing his story. His whole approach is to talk about the fact that we have a story that we ought to know and that we ought to share. And he'll do, I think, 3 sessions Saturday, and then he'll do the Bible class Sunday morning as well as preach Sunday morning. So mark your calendars for that. We'll get more information out as we get closer. So we began last week, or 2 weeks ago, I guess, actually talking about how Jesus said go. Because that's what God has always done. From the very beginning, God has sent people places. God has sent His people to others. God has sent His people into different situations. And what we're going to look at this quarter is not just strictly the evangelistic aspect of it. Because we know when we think, I mean, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. When I think Jesus said go, immediately think, I think go into all the world and preach the gospel. And yes, that is true, and we'll talk about that, but we'll also talk about some of the nuances of some of the things that Jesus tells us to go and do and go and be. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll jump right into it. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this morning. We thank you for this time that we're able to be here together. We thank you for the facility that we have that is comfortable and is just a great place for us to come together and spend time together. God, we're thankful for the cooler temperatures we've had a little bit over the last few days. We do pray for those still fighting the fires and those who are affected by the smoke. Even here, we pray that you will allow this to dissipate soon and that we'll have some fresh, clean air again. God, I pray that you'll be with each each Bible class that's underway this morning. Pray that we will do all we can to honor you with the things that we say and do, and that we'll be encouraged. We'll learn something. And again, God, I pray, but above all of that, that we'll honor you with what we do here this morning. We pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. When you think of great American storytellers, who do you think of? Mark Twain. Who else? Paul Harvey, that's a good one. Will Rogers. Will Rogers from, where's he from? Great state of Oklahoma. Will Rogers, Mark Twain. Who else? Jerry Clower. That's one I wouldn't have thought of. Jerry Clower. If you don't know Jerry Clower, it's probably good. But Jerry Clower was a guy who's a comedian, but man, he told stories. Think of John Steinbeck, a great American author. One more modern storyteller, Steven Spielberg. Great. What makes these people great storytellers? What'd you say? I was going to say, please don't say they tell great stories. Imagination. They have great imaginations. Well, okay, that is actually the correct answer. They tell great stories. Why do they tell great stories? They connect with people. They tell stories that kind of make us go, Kara and I were talking this morning about a book she's reading that has turned out to be not so great, but she said the first couple of chapters, they kind of reel you in a little bit. That's what a storyteller ought to do, is get you into their story. The fact is, one of the greatest storytellers ever was Jesus. Jesus was a great storyteller. You think of Jesus' parables. It's interesting when you try and find how many parables Jesus told. You get somewhere between 30 and 50. One person I read emphatically said 43. So I'm going with 43. But Jesus told stories for just those reasons. Told stories to connect with his audience. Told stories to show his audience he understood who they were, right? I mean, when he talks about telling the parable of the sower, he's telling this story so he can give these people an image that they'll grasp, but also so he'll show them, I understand what it means to be a farmer. I understand what it means to be a sower. When we think about the story, when we think about the stories Jesus told, think about the crowds that came to listen to Jesus. Jesus obviously did this well. When we think about how Jesus told his stories, think back to what we just talked about. Think about, terrible comparison. Think about Jerry Clower. I'm not saying Jesus told stories like Jerry Clower, if you know who he is. But think of these great storytellers, Will Rogers, Mark Twain. They wrap people up in their stories, which tells you Jesus had to have some life in his stories. Jesus had to have some enthusiasm in his stories. Listen, we all have a story. We all have something that we want to tell people about. We all have something that we think is exciting. Maybe it's a vacation you just took. Maybe it's a grandchild. Now, listen, I know some of you all who are grandparents, especially, it seems like especially the newer grandparents, you can't help but talk about your grandkids. I mean, you tell somebody in line at the grocery store about your grandkids. You pull out your phone, start showing them pictures, and they're like, I just got to get out of here. But, I mean, we all want to tell about something. Maybe it's a sporting event. They're not here, so I can pick on them. Our teens at camp, 4 days, they'll be telling stories about little weird, odd things that happened at camp. I know for my family, when our kids were younger and we all went up and down to and from camp together, you get in the car Saturday morning, you're tired and worn out, but the entire trip home, we'd tell stories about things that happened at camp. We get excited. We maybe elaborate a little bit. Maybe we add some details that the person listening probably doesn't care that much about. But we're excited about it. We want to tell our story. So our question for today is, what's your story about Jesus? What is the story that you have about how Jesus has impacted your life? Are you this excited about it? Are you willing to just sit down with some stranger and say, man, I got to tell you? I mean, if I'm at a sporting event, let's say I go to to an Oklahoma State football game and I'm sitting next to somebody from the other team, we're still going to talk about it. We're still going to talk about what just happened. We're still going to be, and because my team's winning, I'm going to be far more excited than the other person. So I'm going to tell them about how terrible no, I'm not going to do that. But we're going to talk about what we're excited about. So what's your story about Jesus? Because what we have to understand is Jesus said, go share your story. Jesus told many people, and Jesus therefore tells us, just go tell your story about Jesus. Just go tell your story about what I did in your life. So what I want us to do this morning is look at two situations in particular where Jesus addresses somebody about telling their story about what he did for him. Turn over to Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1, if you're familiar with Mark's gospel at all, you know Mark just jumps right into it. There's no preamble. It's just, let's get right down to what Jesus does. And you go through, I mean, by verse 14, Jesus is at work in Mark's gospel. But we're going to skip down through some of the things Jesus has already done. He's called his apostles. He's made an impact already. But let's look at beginning in verse 40 and look at this situation here. Let's start at verse 39. He went into all of Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. Then a man with leprosy came to him on his knees and begged him, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. I'm willing, he told him, be made clean. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. Then he sternly warned him and sent him away at once. Okay, let's pause right there. What makes the difference here? When we think about this whole situation, Jesus has healed people. I mean, even in Mark's gospel, he's already done some miraculous things. What's special about this moment? What is it that makes this situation a really big deal? Jesus touched the guy. That's one thing we can't grasp really very well is how significant that was. This is a shot from The Chosen. That to me was one of the more powerful scenes that we've seen. When you read about the importance of human touch, you do some research, you look into even babies, newborn babies that aren't touched enough. There's all sorts of science around human touch. Lepers don't get that because of their condition. Lepers aren't going to be touched. Bill Gaither, he's happy that Jesus did this. He made a killing off this song. I mean, wrote the song, He Touched Me. It's based on this scene, 1960, whatever, 3 or 4, whatever it was. But because it's a big deal that Jesus bothered to stop and touch this guy. Now, our focus, though, is going to be post-touching. Look at what happens next. Where were we? Verse 43, he warned him, sent him on his way at once. Verse 44, telling him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer what Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. Yet he went away and began to proclaim it widely and to spread the news, with the result that Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but he was out in deserted places and they came to him from everywhere. Okay, let's not get to the ending. What does Jesus tell him to do? He specifically tells him, keep it to yourself. Don't tell anybody about this. Why does he do this, though? Why does Jesus tell him to keep it quiet? What somebody said? Yeah, Jesus knew he'd be overwhelmed. There's probably a little bit of that. Yeah. What else? Larry. Yeah, he wanted the priest to verify. That's what the law says. Jesus, I think, number one, I think Jesus just wants him to do what the law says because that's the right thing to do. Go and show the priest. The priests have to check you out. Priests have to determine that you are, in fact, cleansed. But I think what Jesus also wanted to do, I mean, it seems that Jesus also wants these priests to see, I mean, like Larry just said, he wants the priest, because this guy's going to go tell him, the priests are going to go like, wait a minute, you had leprosy yesterday. What happened? They're going to see somebody who's changed. They're going to see a guy who says, well, that Jesus in Nazareth, he's the one that did this. He touched me and made me well. So Jesus wants this leper to go show the priest this act of grace. That somebody touched the guy. Somebody made him well. And once he's clean, the fact is the priests have to accept him. I mean, he's an outcast while he has leprosy. Once he's clean, he can come to the temple. He can do all the things that Jews do. So Jesus is kind of stacking the deck with what he tells this guy to do. Now, do you think Jesus is stunned that the guy doesn't do it? I don't think Jesus is shocked. He's like, oh man, I should have taped that guy's mouth shut. I mean, because we see what the guy does. I mean, blatantly disregards Jesus' admonition. It's one of those things I always kind of wonder, how did Jesus feel about that? But what does the guy do? He goes and tells what happened. Now, when we read what happens here, we look at verse 45 again. It says, yet he went out and began to proclaim it widely and to spread the news, with the result that Jesus was overwhelmed, that the crowds came. Now, what we see here is not that this guy went out and began to immediately tell people, listen, if Jesus came back today, would you go to heaven or not? I'd like to talk to you about your theology. We need to sit down, we need to open up, and we need to look through the Bible. Let's open some scrolls, and we need to figure out what you think about things, and I need to fix it. He didn't do that. What does he do? What's that? Jesus took care of his needs. What does the man do? Yeah. Do you think the guy had to walk along and go, now, how am I going to say this? What am I going to say to these people? It was, I mean, to me, I just kind of picture a spontaneousness. That the guy just goes, I'm sorry, Jesus, thanks for healing me. That's really kind of you, and I appreciate the admonition, but what am I going to do? I mean, to me, I think of Peter and John when they're in front of the Sanhedrin. They say, don't talk about Jesus anymore. And they go, yeah, that's a great idea. I appreciate your advice. But as for us, we cannot help but talk about the things that we've seen and heard. That's what this guy does. Can we do this? Listen, none of us have ever had leprosy, I don't think. Maybe I'm wrong. But none of us have ever been covered with leprosy and healed. But we've been covered with sin and healed. We should have had just as much change as this guy. His was different. His was physical. I mean, his was on his skin and it went away. We've all been touched by Jesus. We've all been changed. So can we tell people that? That's the question. I mean, when we think about the way this happened, you know, for you, I don't know how it happened. Maybe it was after a week at camp and you came home and were like, man, I really got to fix my... Maybe it was after a life of sin that you said, you know, I've got to come. I've got to fix this. Either way, Jesus has touched us. However Jesus touched you in that grave of baptism, you got a story to tell about that. And for some reason, we seem to be very reluctant. This guy not only wasn't reluctant to tell his story, Jesus couldn't stop him from telling his story. When we think about how we were touched, look over Romans chapter 5. Keep your finger there in Mark chapter 1. But look to Romans 5. we think about, we'll get to this in a minute, we think about what our story ought to be. Romans 5, 6 through 8 is a great help for us. Romans 5, beginning in verse 6, you can personalize this a little bit. For while I was still helpless, at the right time Christ died for an ungodly person like me. For rarely will someone die for a just person, though for a good person, perhaps someone might even dare to die. But God proves his own love for us in that while I was still a sinner, Christ died for me. There's your story right there. That all it takes is for us to look at what Jesus has done in our own lives and to personalize that. All it is I was a mess and Jesus fixed my life. I was disconnected from any hope of heaven and Jesus fixed it. Here's how that happened. Our calling is just to personalize that. Tell how this happened to you. Tell what changed in your life. Maybe it's I was a Christian, then I drifted away, and Jesus still welcomed me back, and it changed me. Whatever that is, listen, we can tell every detail of a cool trip to Hawaii or a cool trip to Yellowstone, or we can tell every detail about our grandkids' soccer game when they were 7 years old, and it was 26-0 because one team didn't know how to play. We can tell everything about those things. Our challenge is to tell the details of how Jesus touched us. Okay, so any thoughts on that? We're going to look at one more scene. Dan.
I had mixed signals growing up in the church myself. We don't do testimonials.
Yeah.
To me, that's kind of a mixed signal. We don't do testimonials, and
Tell your story, but not here.
yeah, right. Well, and you guys tell your stories all the time when you preach.
Yeah.
Many times, and that's some of the most meaningful things that can be said when that vulnerability comes out. I have just now gotten comfortable enough with the men that I work with, knowing some of their problems and having worked with them for decades, where I can say, I love you, man. I'm praying for you. I know that hurts. And at times, invite them and say, look, I got a great church that we'd love to embrace you, help you, I'm just now.
Yeah.
And that's, I'm ashamed of it in so many ways, but hopefully I'm maturing there and getting better at it. But I've had to learn that almost on my own.
Well, yeah, the idea of vulnerability is a real thing because for most of us, part of our story is I was once this negative thing, and I don't want to tell anybody that. I was once this, I acted like this, I did this. Jeremy, hey, Lance, could you run that? You just got hired as mic runner to Jeremy. Oh, yeah, if you're raised in the church, you don't want to say, I have these faults, I have this problem, and Jesus fixed it for me, because you got to share the negative, and there's some vulnerability there. Jeremy.
I appreciate that you're pointing out that we all have a story. One time I said in a class, we talk about this idea of a conversion story, that we all have a conversion story.
Yeah.
And I got some feedback on that maybe some people don't feel like they have a conversion story.
Yeah.
A lot of people weren't growing up in the church like myself, and I definitely feel like I have a story to tell as far as my conversion. But people that grew up in the church may not feel like they have this kind of leprosy, changing thing that happened,
Yeah.
Or a conversion like Paul experienced. But that doesn't mean that we don't all have some kind of story to tell.
Right. Yeah, not every conversion story is this dramatic. When I think of my conversion, I grew up in the church. Did I go up? No, there. I grew up in the church. I was young, and there was an idea. I was kind of a punk kid anyway, but there was an idea of obedience and a little bit of fear. I don't mind saying there was a little bit going, oh wow, I've done things wrong. I got to fix it. And then there was just saying, I know I have sin, and I know the answer to sin in my life is Jesus. So that's not super dramatic. But then, like for me, the more dramatic part of it is when I went in a stupid era of my life, and then Jesus welcomed me back, and then the church welcomed me back.
Oh, just a few things. 70% of learning is visual. So people could see him.
Yeah.
Next thing, it's either hearsay versus like a picture story, right?
Right.
Because they're seeing. And then touch is like one of the five senses. So we're sure he's going to want to go out and hug everybody and experience that touch again.
Yeah.
For the first time.
Yeah, Jesus wanted him to go show that this was different. We'll get to that in just a minute. Look over to Mark chapter 5 now. Here's another similar situation. We're not going to read through all of this, but this is a man who's demon possessed. Is in the area of the Gadarenes, is what Mark describes, and he is chained up. He's way out away from everybody, and he's a mess. I mean, people are scared of him. People don't want to be near this guy. But look at what happens here. Let's pick up in verse 15. Jesus cast the demons out. The demons, there's so much interesting here. We just can't get in it. The demons know who Jesus is. They say, don't destroy us. So Jesus casts them into pigs. There's sort of Jewish connotations there. But anyway, and the people see this. The people know this guy. I mean, this guy, it's like if you got a crazy guy living outside of your town, you're going to know. And people know this guy. Now, verse 14. The men who tended them, the pigs, ran off and reported to the town and the countryside, and people went to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the man who had been demon-possessed sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Isn't that interesting? Not happy, not, wow, look, the guy's better. It's like, whoa, what's the deal with this? Because they know this guy's a mess. And they were afraid. Verse 16, those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs. They begin to beg him to leave their region. They're telling Jesus, please go. You have upset the apple cart here. This is not comfortable for us. You're going to need to leave. As he was getting into the boat, let's stop right there. Okay, so what we see here is a gigantic difference made in this man, right? I mean, this guy is crazy out of his mind, and the next minute he's making plans. He's sitting there dressed, he's making travel arrangements, he wants to leave. I mean, he's fit, he is completely changed. Now, one thing I want you to see between what we just saw in Mark chapter 1 and what we see here, that's a common theme. Jesus changes things. Now, Jeremy pointed out, some of us who grew up in the church say, you know, my conversion story wasn't all that dramatic. Well, maybe we need to think about how much did I change? Did I change the way I talk? Did I change the way I dress? Did I change the way I act around my friends? And maybe you think, well, it wasn't that drastic of a change for me because I was a good person already. But you locked into that. This sounds bad. Compare yourself to the rest of our culture. You don't think you've been changed? Even if you were okay in the first place, but you decided this is who I am from now on because of what Jesus has done for me. You don't think that's a change? That's a drastic change. So what we see with this guy is he is not, this isn't just a little bit of a different person. I mean, this isn't the guy who, Jesus doesn't shift the trajectory of this guy. This guy is completely different. I mean, this is as drastic a change as you can even imagine. This is 2 Corinthians 5:17 for us today. If anyone is in Christ, he's what? A new creation, a brand new thing. That's what this guy is. Now, we know, not to belabor the point of completely changed, but we know that's what God does to people. I mean, all through the Bible, you go back to the Old Testament, just say whatever comes to your mind. Her name is Rahab the harlot, Rahab the prostitute is in the ancestry of Jesus because God changed her life. Moses was well-born Egyptian or a Jewish guy who became an Egyptian kid, became an Egyptian. Then he became what? At 40, a murderer. Then he became what? A shepherd. Neither of those things are right home about things. Certainly not the murderer. Murderer and a shepherd. But then he became what? God's messenger, God's deliverer. Because God changes people. You look at the apostles, fishermen, tent makers, regular guys, turned into people who literally changed the entire world. Saul of Tarsus, maybe one of the most striking examples of all. A guy who was a bad guy. Well, I mean, he was so much on this side that even when God speaks to Ananias and says, Saul of Tarsus is going to come to your house, you need to go to this house and you need to go get him. Ananias goes, maybe it's a different last name you're looking for, because I'm not doing that. Because that's what God does. He's in the changing business. Now, I say all of that to say that's part of your story. You may have to think about it. You may have to define that a little bit. And like I said, even if it is just the fact that you're different from culture, you're changed because you've clung on to what Jesus calls you to be. Now, great story so far with this guy, right? Awesome story. But what happens next is what throws us for a loop. Look, let's pick up where we were. As he was getting into the boat, Jesus getting in the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed, the guy who was chained to rocks, the guy who was a menace to society, who Jesus has just healed, comes and says, begged him earnestly that he might remain with him. Now, let me just tell you, I think if I was writing the Bible, and this was my story to write, what would happen here? Jesus would say, well, of course, come and travel with me, and you can be my exhibit A of how powerful I am, and bring a friend or two who knows you're a crazy demon-possessed man, and we'll put you on display, and what a great testimony to me you'll be. But what does Jesus say? Doesn't say go. Jesus says no. He says, no, you're not coming with me. Look what he says. Jesus did not let him, but told him, go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So he went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and they were all amazed. Okay, this is where we're going to park for our last few minutes here. Jesus said, go home to whom? Your people. Why is that significant? They're the people who know him and the people that he knows. Remember, we looked 2 weeks ago at, was it Ezekiel or was it Isaiah? I don't remember. One of the prophets said, listen, you're going to people who know your name, who know your language, who know you know their culture, you know them. That's what Jesus tells this guy. Just go to your people. What's our equivalent? Parallel what Jesus told them to us. Who do we go to? Friends and family, neighbors, co-workers. Yes, we go to Africa. Yes, we go to Guatemala. Yes, we go into all the world. But he tells him, go back home. Go to these people who know what you were and tell them who you are now because of what I've done for you. Jesus says, here's what I want you to do. Go start telling your story right now. So I want to stop here for a minute because there's some lessons we can take from this guy. Jesus tells him right now, go home. Go back to your people right now and start telling what just happened. And the guy does. In fact, we'll see that in a minute. But here's some don'ts that I think we can take from what just happens here. 4 things that I think apply to us today, okay? Number 1, you don't have to be trained to tell your own story. Jesus doesn't tell this guy at all to go to the priest. He doesn't tell him to go sit at the feet of some rabbi and learn some stuff before you go tell anything about me, because you're going to botch this whole deal. He doesn't tell him to go to Bear Valley. He doesn't tell him to go to Harding. He doesn't tell him to go, and I'm not that I have any problem with that at all, because I've done this. But you don't have to be trained. And I think sometimes we get in that mentality, and maybe it's because of how we've been accustomed, how we've been taught. I don't know. Maybe it's an unintentional training that the guy that stands up there is the guy who can tell his story. You know, the preacher guy can tell his story. I don't know how to tell my story. You tell somebody how to tie your shoes? Can you tell somebody about your grandkid? You don't need any training to talk about your grandkids. You don't need any training to talk about your children. You just need to tell it. There's no training that this guy needs. Jesus says, just go tell people what you know. Go tell people what you've experienced. Leads to number 2. You don't have to know all the answers. Again, this guy doesn't know the answers. You think of the number of places we see in the New Testament where people are converted and then begin to teach others. You have to guess they don't have all the answers. This guy in particular, how long has he known Jesus? In his right mind? A few minutes. I mean, we don't know how much the time is, but it doesn't look like it's, that he sat at Jesus' feet for 40 days and 40 nights. I mean, Jesus healed him and he took off. Dan. Yeah, you even think of the apostles. That Jesus sent the apostles out. And then they came back and go, we got some questions. There's some things we're not too sure about. Even at Jesus' ascension into heaven, there's some confusion. After they have spent 40 days with Jesus being taught all the things pertaining to the kingdom of God, he's about to go up to heaven, and one of them says, is now the time you're going to restore the kingdom of Israel? And Jesus is like, so you don't have to know everything. We sometimes think, well, if I start talking about my faith, somebody's going to ask me about, Ezekiel's wheel within a wheel, or Revelation, the beast. Well, tell them you don't know and keep talking about what Jesus did for you. That's the thing. We have to stop using the excuse, I don't know enough. Because if something has happened in your life that involves Jesus, you know enough. If you're in Christ, you know enough. You know enough to tell somebody how you did it. Even, like I said, I know probably when you were in the 5th grade, you had a teacher write out to teach you how to do step-by-step explanations. Tell somebody how to ride a bicycle, and you could do it. I mean, it might take you 3 or 4 tries, but we can tell people what Jesus did for us. Raise your hand. Okay. Okay, 3rd don't. You don't have to be successful. You don't have to have a great reputation. You don't have to say, well, I'm going to wait till I get established in my career. I'm going to wait until I get, I'll wait till I retire, and then I'm really going to tell people about. I'm going to wait until, I've got this problem in my past I need to fix. I'm going to fix that, and then I want to get a little distance from. Look at this guy. I mean, he was a crazy demon-possessed guy 20 minutes ago, and now Jesus says, "Go tell people." You don't have to have everything. Jesus will fix everything for you. You don't have to put now. Listen, that doesn't mean there's some recompense you need to deal with, some things you need to settle with somebody. Maybe you've hurt or whatever. But you don't have to say, well, once I get my career, once I get my kids raised, then I'm really going to be effective. Jesus says, go now. Go tell your story right now. 4th one, it's kind of a weird don't. I had to fix this. Don't refuse to go. Jesus doesn't tell this guy to come with him. He does say go. He said go tell your own people. Don't be the one who said, I'm so afraid to do that. I'm so afraid to talk about my story. Listen, there's all sorts of preacher-isms we could take here. Jesus tells this guy there's some benefits of being right around Jesus together like we are right now. But Jesus doesn't tell this guy, yeah, come stay with me and we'll stay in our little huddle and we won't mess with those mean people. He says, nope, I need you out there. That is so important to notice, so important to remember. This is so great. Our times of being together, our times of worshiping together, fellowship, those are so great, but Jesus needs us out there. Jesus needs us to go tell our people our story. And this is something every one of us can do. So how do we do this? We already pointed out, Jesus told the first guy, go show your story. Live the life you're supposed to live. That's number one. I mean, that's Matthew 5:16. Let your light so shine before men so that when people see your good works, what are they going to do? They're going to glorify God. You're going to tell them, it's not about me. Here's who I am because of what Jesus did for me. So you got to share. Your life needs to reflect what you're going to tell them. In other words, you got to live, because if you're going to sit down and tell somebody how to become a Christian, they're going to go, is that what you are? No thanks. Right? You've got to show people what this life is really all about. Then, we talked about this one too, you got to know your story. 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be ready to give an answer, to give a defense for the hope that's within you. Do it the right way with gentleness and respect, but you got to be ready. Know your story. We just did, whatever it was, last Saturday was Blake's wedding. And we had the wedding people gave us this thing that showed the order of how things are supposed to happen. And we found out, like the day before, that not just the maid of honor and the best man were supposed to do toasts and say something about the bride. We were all supposed to. Mom and dad were supposed to, and it was like, so what did you do? You prepare a little something. I mean, I think for all of us, we got our phones out and we're like, think of something to say, plug this in so I can have it. But you prepare, right? If you have to make a presentation at work, you don't go, I'll deal with that tomorrow. I know this stuff. You prepare yourself. So we got to know our story. Just like what Jeremy was talking about. Maybe your story isn't, you weren't in jail and you were converted by somebody and you changed your life. Maybe it's not that dramatic of a story, but it's your story. So you need to know what your story is. Jesus is a life changer. So that we got to know we got to show our story, we got to know our story, then we just got to go tell it. We got to be willing to sit down with people and say, hey, here's who I am and here's why. Got to be willing to share that story. Just to finish this, that guy, the demon-possessed guy, we know he did what he was supposed to. We know that he listened when Jesus said, go share your story, because in Mark 7, Mark 8, there were over 4,000 people there ready to listen to Jesus back in Decapolis, because that one guy went and told his story. That one guy did what Jesus said. When Jesus said, go tell your story, he did it. So we got to show our story, we got to know our story, and we got to tell our story. And we all have one. We just need to be willing to figure out what it is and be able to verbalize it, be able to share it with people. Any other thoughts? Ma'am. Right. Yeah, Darla said you can't be discouraged if your story doesn't have an impact immediately. You've still done your job. That's the whole planting the seeds thing. You scatter the seeds and see what God does with them. Just because your story doesn't make somebody go, oh, wow, I can't wait to become a Christian. Maybe the next person will. Maybe that'll just plant a seed in that person. Any other thoughts? Okay, we'll pick up next week.